Hi, welcome back to Cosmic and Body Horror. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. Dimensional horrors are large aquatic predators, similar to a mosasaur or other Mesozoic reptile, but with 8 spider-like hairy legs, black hyalescent eyes, and skin covered in slime. They make hissing noises. They can be killed by fire. They are a predatory species originating from another dimension. The people of the ancient city of Dras in Borneo created a mausoleum that acted as a dimensional gateway to allow these creatures to pass through. The Tomb from Beyond, by Jacobi. First published 1933. The present story should satisfy the craving of those of our readers who occasionally like to read a weird scientific tale. It is indeed a rare story that can interweave a theme of growing horror with plausible science. The ancient, forgotten races of Earth may have had strange powers that are beyond our conception. Powers that would make our science seem insignificant in comparison. Powers that may someday be rediscovered by chance or otherwise. And whether these powers would be a blessing or a curse is a matter for conjecture. Here we present a tale that is not technically cold-blooded. The story interest is highly developed, and you are sure to enjoy it. It was in late September, while in the employ of Payne, Largarten and Company, land agents Boston, that I first came into that district known as the Opal Lake country. The 35 miles from Pine Island to Flume I had found necessary to travel by car, no trains making the run on the inland spur for the past 6 years, or since the cessation of the lumbering industry. I was dead tired from a 2-day trip and 6-hour ride on the jerking, creeping local, and my spirits fell even lower as I sat hunched back in the rear seat of the old Ford and surveyed the forlorn aspect of the region that stretched away on all sides. Flume, my destination, I was aware, of course, was one of those depressing oddities that one finds occasionally in the wake of American enthusiasm. A deserted town. But if the conclusion to my trip was to be an inglorious one, the approach was no less depressing. The spent day was chilly and gloomy, a raw wind whining past the windshield from the north, and the tortuous road, unrepaired since its years of unuse, wound in and out through a gaunt graveyard of second growth. To the side, fallen in various angles of despair, stumbled the rotting poles of the abandoned telegraph line, the wires dangling in ensnared coils like some gigantic grapevine withered in decay. Nor was the somberness of my trip made any more pleasant by the personality of my driver. A stolid and taciturn Finn, he answered my questions with nods or unintelligible gutturals around the stem of his pipe and confined his entire attention to the uneven way ahead. It was when we had reached a higher eminence, a point where the road mounted an old terminal moraine, that I, sweeping my gaze below me, remarked to the driver, "Opal Lake, eh?" He grunted in agreement, and I stared down upon that perfect circle embedded there in the growth. Farther on, near the point where I judged the abandoned town of Flume to be, was a much smaller lake, this one curiously in the shape of a half-moon. "And the other?" I asked, looking up once more. "The little Jake off to the right. What is it called?" The driver drew on his pipe, and a cloud of blue smoke, strong with perique, swirled back into my face. Somehow I got the impression that my question had disturbed him. He turned, glanced down at the crescent-shaped strip of water, and his BPS tightened. "That isn't a lake," he said shortly. The man wasn't joking. As I reached for a cigarette and cupped my hands around the match, I was about to reply that my vision, in spite of a need for reading glasses, was still unimpaired. But at that moment, the car struck a deep gash in the road, tilted sharply, and I was forced to clutch hard to keep from being thrown from the seat. When the road had resumed a comparatively even plane again, the thought had passed on. Nightfall had gathered upon us, when half an hour later we swept around a curve and drove into the empty street of Flume. It was here, according to our correspondence arrangement, that I was to meet my client, Julian Trenard. For a moment, as we drove slowly forward, I thought he had forgotten about it. Then we came abreast of the boarded-up building that had once housed the town's furniture store, and I saw him. In the gloom, he seemed at first only a blacker shadow standing there motionless, hands hanging at his sides. He was tall, and his height was even more accentuated by the long black rain poncho that draped loosely from his shoulders. He gave no sign of recognition as we clattered to a halt before him, until I climbed out of the car and stepped forward. "Are you Mr. Trenard?" I asked hesitatingly. My voice sent a visible shock through him, and he started to attention abruptly as though he had been immersed in his thoughts. "I'm Arnold," I continued. "John Arnold of Payne, Largarten Company. You received my letter?" "Yes." He nodded slowly and after a moment extended his hand. "You may dismiss your driver, Arnold. It is only a short distance to my place, and we can talk as we walk." The fact that he neither wished me welcome nor expressed a thankfulness that I had come, even as a matter of courtesy, took me back a bit. And I stood studying the man in silence. In the gathering darkness, the evidences of years spent under a tropical sun were clearly apparent. He stood noticeably erect, shoulders wide and square, marking, it seemed, a man of determination and strength. Yet the left side of his lips twitched constantly, and there was a furtive stare in his eyes that suggested fear. I paid the driver, who, still in silence, handed out my gripsack, then whirled the car around in the center of the street and raced off in the direction from which he had come. "There are two roads," Trenard said abruptly, after the driver had gone, "one skirting the lake and a shorter one through the woods. Which do you prefer?" "There is a lake, then?" I asked, remembering the queer remark of the driver. For a moment, Trenard made no answer. He stared straight ahead of him and walked forward a couple of paces. "A lakeys," he said slowly. "A lake of hell." Needless to say, this cabalistic statement set my brain in turmoil again, and I could find no words for reply. We reached the edge of town and entered the remnants of an old logging road, merely two ruts in most places, necessitating my walking on one side and Trenard 4 feet away on the other. The man gave no indication of commencing that conversation which he had declared the march to his house would permit, and we paced along in silence. It was quite dark now, the way before us walled in by 2 lines of towering trees. Up above, thick velvet clouds swept across the low-hanging sky, but off to the east, a growing circle of radiance showed where the moon was trying to break through. As the man continued to say nothing, and I could think of nothing worthy of disturbing his study, I fell into a deep thought myself, musing on all his colourful history which had so intrigued the world a year before. Here, then, was the leader of that epoch-making Trenard-fielding expedition, which, in the face of all scientific ridicule, had discovered off the coast of British North Borneo the remnants of a hitherto unknown civilization, the unchronicled, unfabled city of Dras. I remembered the lengthy newspaper accounts that had been devoted to the finding of the submerged titty and the queer artifacts brought back to New York. Down there on the sea floor, Trenard had walked the streets of a city buried under water for centuries. He had found marble buildings, architecture unaffected by Roman or Arab invasion, statues of deities of a distinct and separate religion, and carven hieroglyphics that were as yet undecipherable. It was indeed a success. But Fielding had not fared so well. His sudden death had been a shock to the entire country, and especially to his colleagues back in the University of Virginia. There were queer rumors about his being killed by some unseen sea monster which lurked there in the depths, rumors that had been partially verified by other members of the expedition, but in all cases stoutly denied by Trenard. In the exact center of the water-covered city, according to Trenard's popular book, The Mysteries of Sunken Dras, which I had browsed through, he had found a large mausoleum where apparently were entombed the 5 kings of the last dynasty. And for some reason, Trenard had been so taken up by either the architectural beauty or the regal associations of this edifice that he had raised it to the surface, segment by segment, and shipped it back to the United States. It was a tremendous undertaking, involving the use of costly derricks and equipment and endangering the lives of the men. Why Trenard should have chosen this one building to raise rather than the many others, and why indeed he should have sacrificed further exploration and the removal of other objects to raise any at all, was, to the popular mind, a mystery. It was said, of course, that the touch of fever, which had delayed him for 3 weeks at Kuching on the west coast of Borneo, had left his mind unbalanced. It was also said that the radiogram which had come to him out there in the Java Sea telling of the sudden death of his sister Sylvia, had left him half mad and brought about a strange obsession. At any rate, Trinard had taken the mausoleum back with him to New York. Then, at further expense, he had conveyed it by train and motor truck to his wilderness home near the town of Flume. That was a year ago. Flume at that time was only a monument of past industry. Only some 75 persons remained in the village. But I had heard or read somewhere that 3 months after the mausoleum had been set up in the town cemetery and the body of his deceased sister Sylvia, entombed in it, every one of those 75 had packed up and left en masse. Chapter 2. The Mysteries of Sunken Dras. My reverie suddenly came to an end when Trinard, grasping my arm and speaking for the first time in many moments, said, "The road forks here. Let us take the wood path. The lake road is considerably longer." I nodded in agreement and increased my pace to keep up with him. Abruptly, the way before us opened upon a large glade, and there, 50 yards ahead, loomed the walls of a huge oblong house. I stared at it coldly. Even in the half-darkness, the severe style of its architecture was apparent. The building, though framed, had not the slightest suggestion of gable or ornamentation, and rose straight up and across like an enormous packing case. Trinard led the way to a small door, unlatched it with a key, and ushered me inside. To an interior decorator, I presume, that chamber would have appealed as being furnished in good taste. But to me, depressed already by the somberness of my passage through the September woods, it seemed even more austere than the buildings outside. The white walls ran up 2 stories to an arched ceiling of a sickly-hued blue. On the side opposite me, halfway up, extended a small gallery swerving out over the room in a wide curve and terminating in a steep staircase, the balustrade fashioned of polished silver. There was a white porcelain bookcase in one corner, and on its top stood 2 curious ebony figures. One was in the likeness of a large deep-sea fish, with huge scales and a bloated middle portion. The other, complete in every detail, was a carving of a diver with helmet and full equipment all in all. The room gave the impression of utter coldness, and my eyes moved from side to side, searching for a bit of red or brown to break the frigid monotony. Trinard had removed his hat and coat now. He moved toward a connecting door, saying, "Make yourself comfortable for a few moments, Arnold. I'll get you a little refreshment. I have no servants. I've lived here alone since the death of my sister, you know." Before I could explain that I had eaten heartily in Pine Island, he had gone, and I was left to my thoughts. I stood there a moment musing over the strange ways a man's ornamental fancies will manifest themselves. Then, lighting a cigarette, I tossed my hat and coat to a chair and strolled over to the bookcase. There were the volumes I had expected to find: atlases, travel accounts, texts on deep-sea diving, Wallace's Malay Archipelago, and 1 or 2 technical works on ancient civilizations. But my attention was attracted abruptly from the bookshelves to a large framed picture hanging on the white wall. It was an enlarged photograph, a scene taken underwater by a submerged camera. It presented, I realized instantly, a street view of the sunken city of Dras. Vaguely, through the blur of the water and under the glare of what apparently was the submarine's beam light, had been snapped a formless mass of ornate buildings, shadowy columns and capitals. It was indistinct, yet that very lack of line and boundary increased its mystery and appeal. In the foreground could be distinguished a school of fish, and at a point in the rear, above the city, hung a black shapeless mass, which apparently had failed to register in the lens of the camera. Toward this latter object I suddenly found my gaze attracted. For an instant I stood there wondering what could have caused this blotch on an otherwise almost incredibly perfect photograph. Then slowly there came a singular sensation that my eyes were being held in focus, that another will stronger than my own would not permit them to turn away. It was inexplicable, that feeling. It seemed as though some hidden eye were looking from beneath that discoloration on the print, gazing at me with the controlling stare of a hypnotist. A moment later, I thought that formless shadow had begun to move, to creep slowly toward me with the sluggish wavering movement of a heavy body in deep water. Heavy steps and a slamming door broke the spell abruptly, and I turned to meet Trinard approaching with a tray of china. He sat across from me, lit an old meerschaum pipe, and proceeded to lose himself amid clouds of tobacco smoke. "Mr. Trinard," I said at length. My repast finished. If we can agree on one subject, that of price, I believe my business may be concluded here with as little trouble and as quickly as possible. We have found a potential purchaser of your property. You must realize, however, that inconveniences caused by the abandonment of the town of Flume, you cannot command a very high price. He seemed noticeably relieved at this information, and eyeing aside his pipe, replied quickly, "Then I will accept the offer, whatever it is. I've got to get away from here, and I can't do it until I've realized the money invested on the property." I nodded, puzzled at his marked vehemence. "My company will live up to its reputation of fairness," I assured him. "As your agent, we will ask only the customary commission for finding a purchaser and completing the transaction." "Shall we draw up the papers now, then, and I will leave in the morning?" "The papers can wait," Trinard replied. "It will be easier to write by daylight, and if you will pardon me, I am in the custom of retiring early. You may stay here and read if you like. Your room is readied by the staircase and is the second door to the right." I nodded silently and watched him as he climbed the staircase with my gripsack and disappeared somewhere in the darkness of the gallery above. Again he was either thoughtless, disturbed, or characteristically impolite, for he made no offer to bid me good night. After my refreshment, the profound weariness which had so dulled me since my arrival in Pine Island had gradually left, and I now experienced no desire for sleep. I picked up a leather-bound copy of Trinard's book, The Mysteries of Sunken Dras, and absently opened it. A clock ticked slowly, steadily, somewhere, as I glanced at random through the pages. Presently I came to several passages which had been underlined with pencil, and before them my eyes hesitated long enough to read. A careful study of the hieroglyphics on the tomb has led me to the belief that the inhabitants of Dras had reached an intelligence considerably higher than the average observer would gather by merely examining the artifacts brought to the surface. I am of the opinion that the scholars and wise men at the courts of the 5 kings of the last dynasty had probed to a remarkable degree the most profound depths of abstract mathematical calculation and theoretical physics, and again, the Drasian theology seems to have been an unexplainable combination of the vilest forms of demonology and a scientific concept of the relation between time and space, or to be exact, a religious intellection based on the belief that the 4-dimensional continuum, as we would term it today, is teeming with gargoyle horrors, difoulness of which the finite mind cannot even conceive. In this respect, I am almost led to believe that Einstein was crudely antedated thousands of years. Dry and bookish as these statements were, I gave them considerable thought. Toward the end of the volume, thrust in the pages, I came upon a scrap of paper covered with penciled writing. Let me say that ordinarily I am not addicted to reading other people's personal notations, but almost before I realized it, I was staring at the following. Can it be possible that the mausoleum's space interior itself constitutes a disruption of the space-time coordinates, a channel, so to speak, an opening formed in some unknown way by the priests of Dras, which leads from our own 3-dimensional world into the 4th dimension? It is a thought which seems unbelievable, yet the strange tales the villagers told and their frantic exodus from Flume would confirm it. Surely Fielding's story, which he told before he went down the last time, was untrue. But even if true, it would be mad to think it has followed me, and is out there now, out there, God forbid, with poor Sylvia. What does it all mean? Today, one of the forest rangers from the district north of here passed through and confirmed what I had already guessed to be true. The government-made dike constructed to keep Opal Lake at its level on the north shore has been wearing away, and there is danger of inundation. How high the water will rise if it breaks through, I can't imagine. But I must get away from here. I shall go mad if I stay. Chapter 3. Into the Swamp. I sat back and stared at these enigmatic lines, frowning. Undoubtedly it was Trinard's handwriting, but what, in the note's own words, did it all mean? At length, shrugging, I closed the book, tossed it to the table, and rose to my feet. There was a small half-sized door just before me, and if nothing else, it offered a way out of my thoughts. I longed to get out of the room. Its cold, white walls, blue ceiling, and bleak furnishings produced in me that same sense of cheerlessness one finds in the interior of a hospital. I opened the door and stepped out under the night sky. It was a small balcony that extended over the rear of the house. Even as I walked to the edge of the railing, the moon suddenly broke through a last rift of clouds, and I saw below me, like a sheath of ribbed silver, a long and narrow lake, the water swashing against the bushes almost at the building's foundation, the farther shores hidden by an intervening fringe of trees. Straight ahead, the gently rising surface was unbroken, but off to the left, toward the abandoned town of Flume, tile water was dotted with orderly rows of white objects, which at that distance appeared to be pieces of anchored chalk. Farther on huddled a heavy shadow, the outlines of some huge building. For a moment I stood there musing. Then, as my eyes were drawn once again to those rows of white things, a little thrill of understanding swept through me. The driver who had brought me from Pine Island had been right. This wasn't a lake. Those even files of white blocks were tombstones, and the expanse of water before me must and be a development of recent months. An inundated graveyard. The dike on Opal Lake's northern shore had finally worn away, and the water, seeking its own level, had flowed here, flooding without respect the last resting place of Flume's dead. Looking directly below me now, I saw half in the moonlight, half in the shadow, a small flat-bottomed duckboat drawn up on the bush-lined shore. Why indeed? My host should have wished to row out on such a body of water struck me as most singular. And yet, as I gazed at the little craft and the short, stubby oars thrown carelessly beside it, there came a distinct impulse that I myself go out on the moonlit water. I debated a moment, then lifting myself over the railing, dropping the short distance to the ground below. There was a certain macabre attraction to the scene before me. 5 seconds later I had adjusted the oars in the locks and shoved the boat gently into the lapping waves. Without knowing why, I headed due east, following the line of the shore. The moon, though high in the indigo heavens, seemed strangely bloated and out of proportion. As I rode farther and farther, the white blank wall that marked Trenard's house fell back deeper into the gloom of foliage and looked out at me like an eyeless face swathed in a cowl. At intervals, I rested my oars across the thwart and sat surveying the scene. Presently I was in that part of the lake that was directly over the old graveyard, and looking over my shoulder I could see, some distance ahead, Trenard's mausoleum. There, within its ancient walls, was entombed the man's sister Sylvia, buried in a monument that had once held the 5 kings of Dras. I pulled Lyada on my left oar and headed toward it. The lake was even narrower here, the banks close, and I could see row on row of white tombstones and tilting crosses rising above the water. Waves squashed against them in a low, liquid dirge. The water, too, seemed clearer than that fronting Trenard's house. Looking down over the boat's gunwales, I thought I saw more gravestones and crosses far below in the dark depths, gleaming white like scattered mounds of bleached bones. Then the shadowy mass of the mausoleum rose like a curtain before me. To a general appearance, the architecture might be classed as Oriental, the domed roof rising gracefully like a Mohammedan mosque. Above the doorway, a hideous gargoyle perched on a block of stone. I dipped my oars and brought the boat around to the other side, dark there with the shadow of the hidden moonlight, but still revealing a small iron-barred window that had been cut through the wall. With the boat bobbing close to the stone side, I steadied myself, reached up and strove to see into the interior. My curiosity was disappointed. I saw nothing. Only a well of blackness met my eyes. For a moment I remained in that perilous position, staring between the bars. And then, my head jerked back with revulsion. Sweeping to my nostrils from the inner recesses of that vault had come a horrible fetid smell, a loathsome odor of unutterable filth. It surged out upon me like a putrescent blanket of green mold, gagging my throat and larynx. I clung there, retching and gasping. For an instant, there was only silence and that festering breath. Then, without warning, there came from within those walls a prolonged hiss like escaping steam and a heavy sluggish splashing in the interior water. Something cold and clammy slid across my hands clenched there on the iron bars, and I whipped them away dripping with blood, gashed to the bone. I did not cry out, only dropped back into the boat and began to row furiously for the shore. I worked the paddles with might and main until my shoulders ached in their sockets. My heart pounded like a runner's. Back in my own room in Trenard's house, I sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands. Both were marked with deep, ragged gashes between the wrist and first knuckle. Blood gushed from the wounds, dyed the fingers crimson. Confused, bewildered, I poured a quantity of water and carefully bathed the injured members. Then, utilizing the little first aid kit I always carry in my grip sack, I carefully bathed the gashes in iodine, then applied gauze and adhesive tape. How long I lay there awake, I cannot tell. My brain was whirling round and round, seeking an answer to it all. But at length I lapsed into a fitful slumber. The rumble of thunder was in my ears when I awoke. Rain was slashing the pane of my bedroom window, and in the early morning gloom, a wall of trees, just beyond, were bending double in the face of a raging wind. I jumped to my feet with an exclamation. Bad weather meant bad roads, and considering the disrepair of the Flumpine Island Trail, this unexpected storm might cause an enforced stay in Trinard's house. An outlook which, as I considered it, rose to appalling proportions. Dressed, I made my way downstairs to find my worst fears realized. The rain was slanting down in torrents, and the path that led across the glade into the woods was a swirling river of mud and water. The little door leading to the balcony that faced the lake was open, and stepping to the sill, I paused and looked out. Julian Trinard was standing at the railing, staring out ahead of him at the foaming lake. He was drenched to the skin, and the water was running down his face in tiny rivulets. Suddenly he became aware of my presence, whirled around and stepped back into the room. I watched him as he moved to a chair and sank into it with a low moan. "Arnold," he said, "have you ever gone into the theory of relativity? Do you know anything of the principles of space-time, of the fourth dimension? Do you believe there are other worlds around us, worlds which, because of our limited three-dimensional senses, we cannot see or understand?" I took out a cigarette, lit it twice before I made my reply. "Yes, of course," I said. "I'm not so strong on my science, but I've read the usual articles." "Why?" The nerve near Trinard's mouth was twitching violently now. He got up, paced to the farther wall and back again, then hesitated before me, leaning hard on the tabletop. "And do you believe it to be true that in that other fourth-dimensional world there exist forms of life entirely removed from our own evolutionary scale? Creatures horrible beyond the farthest reaches of our imagination? Do you believe that?" "Who knows?" I replied. "It's logical, I suppose, but the unknown is always popularly embodied with strange terrors. So far, we have only a tangle of mathematical calculations to go by." He turned away without listening, and as I looked after him curiously, I thought I saw his lips form the words over and over again. "Oh, Sylvia, Sylvia." Both breakfast and the subsequent business formalities were dismal affairs. The storm, instead of dying down, grew steadily in fury, and we sat in that cheerless room with the thunder hammering overhead, and the wind rushing by the outer walls with the screams of a frightened child. Noon came and passed, with Trinard making no suggestion of a lunch. Curiously enough, the man had not seemed to notice the fact that both my hands were thickly bound in bandages. Or if he did, he asked no questions about them. The wounds, incidentally, were causing me constant worry. Though I had not inspected them since the night before, they felt hot and feverish, and an unpleasant sensation of a pulse beating deep in the gashes made me resolve to visit a doctor immediately upon my return to Boston. But the unexplainable events, of which those hurts were a climax, I deliberately thrust from my mind. That was something I could not think of without trembling in horror. Abruptly at 5 o'clock the rain and the wind came to an end, and there was left only an occasional sullen, delayed burst of thunder. The storm had passed on. With the quieting of the elements, Trinard suddenly roused himself into action. A tremor seemed to pass through him from head to foot, and he called softly, "I'm coming, Sylvia. I'll take you away." Yue ran madly across the room, flung open the outer door and disappeared. Moments dragged by as I stood looking after him. Had the man reached the climax of some mental malady? Were his queer actions, his apparent obsession, the result of a diseased brain? An instant I waited in indecision. Then, as the cold gloominess of that room slowly gathered around me, I strode to the door and followed him. His footprints were embedded there in the wet loam, and slowly, half held back by some inner dread, I traced them around the outer wall of the house. At first I thought he was making for the little duck boat I had used the night before, but the trail led farther on, through a dense thicket, down into a low marshy section of land, and finally to the edge of the lake. I drew up behind the bole of a tree and peered ahead of me. Trinard was there, up to his knees in water, dragging a huge flat-bottomed barge to the shore from its anchoring buoy. Along the strip of beach stood 7 steel drums, black barrels of apparently 50-gallon capacity. I could not even guess at their contents. As I watched, Trinard began to roll the barrels one by one onto the barge. They were terrifically heavy, it seemed, the man apparently using every ounce of his strength in the task. The barge itself was a strange affair. Half raft, half boat, it was made of untrimmed logs, bound together with wire and rope of every size and description. Puzzled, unable to understand his actions, I kept in the protective shadow of the tree and watched tile work slowly being completed. Trinard was laboring like a madman now. Sweat was streaming from his forehead. He had thrown off his coat, and hatless, his hair hung wildly over his eyes. At length, the last barrel was moved from the beach to the barge. Without a glance behind, Trinard leaped aboard, seized a long wooden staff, and began poling out into the lake. 50 feet from the shore, the depth became too great for the use of the pole, and he discarded it for a crude, square-bladed paddle arrangement which he operated from a socket in the bow. For a long while, I watched him as he worked the clumsy craft slowly into the upper reaches of the lake. Then, when an intervening fringe of trees hid him from sight, I turned, ran back to the little duckboat, threw in the oars, and shoved off in pursuit. Curiosity once more had gotten the better of me. Chapter 4. Encounter with the Dimensional Horror. The lake lay as flat and motionless as a great mirror, and the tombstones ahead seemed only lighter reflections of the leaden sky. Ahead, the domed mausoleum reared itself above the colorless water like some ugly sprawling beetle, but Trinard did not steer directly for the tomb. Carefully, as one proceeding under a long premeditated plan, he maneuvered the barge to a point some 40 or 50 feet from the vault's entrance, and the tomb from beyond 363 there. Halting his paddling, seized one of the steel barrels and rolled it to the boat's edge. Gradually lessening the intervening space, I rowed my own craft parallel to the bank, watching him. He had resumed his paddling again now, moving slowly forward with that one barrel still lying at the edge of the barge, almost touching the water. From that barrel, a dark, heavy liquid was pouring onto the lake, coloring the surface with a gleaming purple-black, thickening in an ever-widening circle. It was oil. No other fluid would act in like manner when in contact with water. Round and round the mausoleum Trinard directed the barge. I was quite near now, and I could see the mingled expression of fear and determination in the man's face, the wild stare in his black eyes. Back and forth he worked the enormous socket paddle, and in his wake grew a steadily widening trail of oil. When the steel drum was emptied, Trinard shoved it into the water and rolled another into position. And thus he repeated the process, circumnavigating the tomb again and again until the surface of the lake was black with petroleum. At length, the contents of the 7 barrels were emptied, and Trinard headed for the vault entrance. He lashed the mooring rope around one of the narrow stone columns, leaped out, and waded over the water-covered stairs to the door. A moment later, I heard the iron barrier clang open and saw him disappear into the interior. 5 minutes passed, an eternity with only the gentle lapping of the water on the surrounding masonry. Then, as I leaned over the gunwale watching, Trinard reappeared, and I started as if struck by a blow. From the entrance of the vault, he was dragging a heavy, oblong shape, struggling to slide it onto the barge. A black wooden box it was, a coffin, the carved and ornamented casket of his sister Sylvia. But something was wrong. The man was making frantic efforts to close the iron door behind him. He was straining backward, arms bent double, exerting all his strength to force it into position. There was but a foot separating it from the latch, yet some interior force seemed holding it open. Suddenly Trinard threw back his hands and uttered a shriek of horror. He released the door and with one wild lunge threw himself onto the barge, unfastened the mooring rope, and seized the paddle arm. Back and forth he shot the blade, churning through the thick water. The clumsy craft began to move slowly away from the tomb, and then I can only chronicle the events that followed from the nightmare train of horror images that remain engraved on my mind. From the entrance of the domed mausoleum there emerged a thing which sent a wave of terror streaking down my spine. It was utterly bestial. It was a sight so indescribably loathsome and repulsive that it held me there in the boat, rigid and unable to believe my eyes, doubting my very sanity. Creeping over the water-covered steps, past the carved columns, came a huge, bloated, semi-saurian monster, a giant sea serpent, an enormous water reptile, and yet a creature with 8 jointed, hairy spider legs like some hybrid insect from the canvas of the mad August Schlegel. The body, sliding endlessly from the inner recesses of the vault, was a gleaming, lubricous black, the head, a flat, pointed, featureless mass. As I stared out upon it and a great nausea rose up within me, I subconsciously catalogued it, in spite of those hairy spider-like appendages, as something akin to a mosasaur, the giant sea snake that infested the prehistoric seas of the later Mesozoic. And yet, though I am neither biologist nor student of paleontology, though I have never, beyond casual browsing, delved into the little-known subject of deep-pressure marine life, I knew it to be no naturally evolved form of life of my own mundane world. Head and 3 long undulations above the surface, jaws dripping slaver, it poised there, then suddenly lunged straight at Trinard. Again the man screamed, and the cry shot over the lake, wailing to the farthest shore. He was working like a madman at the socket oar now, churning the oily water in great foaming waves, and the barge, with the coffin in its center, moved sluggishly forward. And as I sat, transfixed, in the boat, I thought I understood. The interior of that mausoleum, where once had been entombed the 5 kings of Dras, constituted a channel, an opening in space, formed in some strange way by the priests of that ancient city, leading from our own 3-dimensional world to that of the 4th dimension. When Trinard had raised the tomb to the surface from the seafloor, transported it here to the Flume Cemetery, the passage through space-time had not disturbed that opening. It still existed in the vault's interior, a door to the world beyond. Good God! Now I saw the reason for Trinard's actions. He had guessed all this too, long before. He had lived a life of constant growing dread in his lonely home, and had gradually become obsessed with the horrible thought that the body of his sister Sylvia was out there with the monster, that her unprotected coffin was within the thing's reach. Was not death in our plane but a process of transmutation, of metempsychosis into another world? And would not that ghastly creature drag her into a pit of deepest corruption where she would be imprisoned forever? The huge thing, body glistening with slime, hairy appendages slowly treading water, was moving forward in pursuit of the barge, and Trinard was struggling at the socket oar, casting frantic glances behind him. It was a death race, an impossible combat between a supernormal entity from another plane and a man crazed with fear. On swept the barge, the square prow turning the oily surface of the lake into a river of creaming ink. Behind, and scattered at intervals near the mausoleum, floated the 7 empty steel drums, half submerged, like so many black porpoises drifting in uninterested sleep. Off on the southern shore, a blue jay sent its sharp cry of reality into the heavy air. For a moment I closed my eyes, telling myself that when I opened them again, I would find it had all been some horrible dream. So much, and no more will the human brain receive that is utterly alien. But when I again looked upon that monstrosity coiling through the water before me, a wave of terror swept through me from head to foot. Scarcely 10 yards apart, they were now, and even from where I sat in the duckboat, I could see the veins on Trinard's brow extend as he worked the huge paddle, like taut wire. Mercifully, perhaps, the occurrences of the next few instants have been blurred in my memory in a hideous maelstrom of confusion. I have, however, a nightmare recollection of leaping to my feet, the impact almost swamping the duckboat, and screaming one wild scream. "Trinard! Trinard!" Oh my God! There it was, poised on the surface of the lake, a thing to be compared with no mundane standards, a creation from the inner reaches of a geometric hell. Python body stretched flat downward now, hairy spider legs motionless. Then, with a hiss, it closed in on him. Trinard had only an instant, a single split fraction of time. With a leap, he whirled away from the arm of the socket paddle and clawed madly at his pockets. His hands brought forth something I could not recognize. I saw him fumble with it, open it, and extract something from its interior. Once, twice, He moved his fingers in frantic jerks. Then a pinpoint of orange flame flared up, and with a start I understood. Matches! Trinard meant to ignite the heavy film of oil that covered the surface of the water. He had planned this carefully, as the one and only means of self-preservation. Now he turned the flame of the match to the box itself and flung the flaming missile out before him. Then with a scream he looked over his shoulder. The thing was upon him, foul head lunging over the edge of the barge, hissing in diabolical fury. By sheer force, Trinard seemed to wrench himself from the hypnotic stare of those black, hyalescent eyes. He lurched to the opposite end of the barge and flung himself wide and clear into the thick water. Even as his body momentarily disappeared beneath the surface, a wall of flame shot up over the spot, raced toward the monster and the barge, mounting with the rapidity of an inferno. I can tell little more. Stricken dumb, held motionless there, amid the swooshing tombstones, I saw the whole tableau before me transform on the instant into a roaring cauldron of madness. There came a violent lashing and floundering as the monster found itself caught in the center of it. One after another, 7 times in succession, I saw the spider legs burst into flame, curl and shrivel like burning rope, and finally drop off. Up from the cremating body rose a thick greenish miasma, sickening with a stench of burning putrefaction. The lake was singing with flame now. Red reflections stabbed deep into the water depths. The barge and its coffin cargo were a raging holocaust, a floating funeral pyre swiftly being consumed. Of Trinard, there was no sign. Only flaming oil leaping higher and higher, swirled over the spot where he had disappeared. Abruptly, a dense billow of black smoke, heavy as felt, belched upward and hid it all in a thick, pungent curtain. But I had no wish to see more. I seized the oars of the duck-boat and rowed madly to the beach. 5 feet from the shore I leaped into the water and ran wildly old, through logging road dripping and into woods, the abandoned down the town of Flume. To this day, my passage from the lake across the long tortuous miles to Pine Island remains a blank spot in the record of my memory. There is but a single instant during the endless hours of that advance which I can recall with any degree of clarity, a moment when I reached a higher, open point on the old road and looked out upon a scene that probed its gloom into the lowest reaches of my soul. The lowering sky was deepening into dusk, and the wilderness stretched below me, a dark carpet of undulating green. In its center, like a leaden wedge, lay the elliptical expanse of that lake. Off to the side brooded a heavier shadow, which I knew to be the Dras mausoleum, and over all, from shore to shore, hung a slowly diminishing cloud of smoke. End of The Tomb from Beyond by Jacobi. This is the end of the story. Tell us what you think in the comment section. Please subscribe and ring the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we release new content. If you want to support us, consider joining our channel membership. You will get instant early access to more than 100 stories before their release. This is the only way to support our channel.